All right, so this is going to be the lecture recording for Chapter 1, the first part of Chapter 1, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. We'll cover the remainder of Chapter 1 in our first lab lecture recording, or lab video recording. So this class is the first in a series of 2 classes that cover human anatomy and physiology. So we are going to be integrating anatomy and physiology together and studying them together. So instead of having one class on anatomy where you just learn the structure and then another class on physiology where you just learn the function, we're bringing them together, and we have 2 classes, but the first half is going to study anatomy and physiology. We'll review chemistry, cell biology, and learn about the cells and the tissues and all of that. And then the second half, which is 169, we'll learn more about a lot of the different organ systems. So the first thing we need to learn is what anatomy and physiology mean. So anatomy studies the form and structure of the body. So this is what things look like, and we're going to focus more on anatomy during lab. And we usually will study the anatomy of something first, right? This is what it looks like, what it's made of, and then we're going to start looking at the physiology, and this examines how the body functions. And sometimes we'll even go down to a cellular level to see exactly what those cells and those molecules are doing. And form and function are interrelated, right? So in order for something to work, right, it needs to have a specific structure. So usually form follows function, so one depends on the other. So in order for us to understand the physiology of something, we need to really know what it looks like, right? We need to know what the form is, and we need to know like the structure of the cell in order to understand sort of how it works. When we talk about the cell membrane, we need to know what it's made of before we talk about how molecules can move across it. So these things are really important, and they're related to each other. So first we'll talk a little bit about anatomy. Anatomy has a couple of different subdivisions, and the first one we'll talk about is microscopic anatomy. And these are things that you need to look at under a microscope, right? That makes sense. It's microscopic anatomy. These examine structures that cannot be observed by the unaided eye. That means you can't see them without using, a magnifying glass, a microscope, something special to help you see these tiny little structures. The basic divisions of microscopic anatomy are going to be cytology, which is the study of cells, and histology, which is the study of tissues. So chapter 4 in this class is going to go over the study of cells, so we'll be doing a little bit of cytology there. And then chapter 5 is going to introduce the basics of tissues, which is histology. Both of these are too small, right? They're very small. We can't really see them with our unaided eye. Gross anatomy, or macroscopic anatomy, is going to investigate structures that you can see without a microscope. I usually think that gross anatomy would be like if you were doing an autopsy, right? That's things, we're opening up the body and looking at the organs, and we're looking at things in there with our eyes. And autopsies are kind of gross, so you can think gross anatomy. The other thing is to look at the word macroscopic versus microscopic, right? So micro means really small, whereas macro means really large. This brings me to a little aside that I want to mention is medical terminology is going to be very important for this course. There's a lot of new terms that we're going to be learning. And so there are a couple of good worksheets that I have included, and you can find them on Blackboard, that go over a little bit about medical terminology and the anatomy of a medical term. And I've also got a couple of reference sheets that go over some of the prefixes, suffixes, and roots. It'll be good to familiarize yourself with those, because there's a lot of new information and new terms that we're going to be learning in 8 very short weeks for the summer, or 16 weeks if you're going a more traditional schedule, but either way, it's a very short amount of time. So gross anatomy, as we said, this is something where we're looking at bigger structures. We're looking at organs, we're looking at bones, we're looking at muscles, the skin. So these we can see with our eyes. And think about dissections. That's a gross anatomy. Think about dissections, autopsies, things like that. That's how I remember the name. So there are a couple of different divisions of gross anatomy. So systemic anatomy is the study of anatomy that looks at each different body system one at a time. And that's what this class is going to be divided into. We're dividing our study of anatomy into different body systems. And we'll get into all the different systems at the end of this PowerPoint. Regional anatomy would be another way that we could learn. And so we would learn, instead of going through and learning all of the vessels in the body at the same time as part of our cardiovascular, we would learn about maybe just the head. And so you would learn about the special senses in the head, you learn about the brain, all the vessels and nerves in the head. And this can be important if you're going to be specializing in a certain part of the body. Like, for example, if you're working with a hand surgeon and you guys do a lot of things just on the hands, you might want to take a class about the regional anatomy of the hand just to learn exactly what goes on in that spot. Surface anatomy focuses on superficial anatomic markings. Comparative anatomy examines anatomical similarities and differences between different species. So if we were going to look at a horse and a dog and a person and say, well, how does the front limb of the horse differ from the front limb of a dog, and how does that differ from the hands of people, and how did they evolve differently? And then embryology is its own study, and it studies the developmental changes from conception to birth. We will talk a very little bit about embryology in the very end of 169. But mostly, this book is going to be divided into systemic anatomy, right? So we're going to go through all the different anatomy and physiology of each system. We do have a couple of other types of anatomy that focus on either diagnosis or research. So pathologic anatomy, so pathology is the study of diseases, and pathologic anatomy examines anatomic changes that result from diseases. So if we look at a disease and see how it changes those organs. Radiographic anatomy is going to be, a radiograph is another term for an x-ray. So radiographic anatomy is going to look at internal structures that we can see based on scanning procedures like radiographs or CTs or MRIs, things like that. So these are a little bit more clinically based. So we said anatomy was first, and that's usually what we learn, where we learn the structure of things, what they're made of, what it looks like. And then next we move on to the physiology, and these are the details of the functions. And a lot of times this will go down to the cellular and molecular level to see exactly how these things happen. And we'll talk in detail about this when we talk about the chapter 4, the cell, and then we talk about exactly how the action potential works and exactly how muscles contract. And so we do need to understand the underlying anatomy first before we can really figure out how these things work and what physiology is and how things function. So there are also some subdisciplines of physiology, and if you know your medical terminology, these should be pretty easy to figure out. So cardiovascular, so cardio means heart, vascular is for vessels, so cardiovascular physiology examines the function of the heart and the blood vessels in the blood. Neurophysiology, so neuro has to do with nerves and the nervous system, and that's going to study the functions of nerves. Respiratory physiology studies the physiology of the respiratory system. Reproductive physiology studies the physiology of the reproductive system and all the hormones involved. And then finally, pathophysiology. Remember, we said that pathology was the study of diseases, so pathophysiology is the function of a body system during disease or injury to that system. And so in our class, we're going to be focusing on normal anatomy and understanding normal anatomy, but we will occasionally do case studies and talk a little bit about different disease processes and how they change the normal anatomy. So once again, as I said, the form or anatomy of something is really, really related to the function or physiology. And by learning about both of them at the same time, it's easier to connect those topics. So if you learned about the anatomy of the heart one year and then didn't learn about the function of the heart until the next year, you might not remember as much about the anatomy and you'd have to kind of relearn it. So sometimes it's good to learn them together. Both anatomy and physiology rely on each other. There is a term called form follows function, right? Anatomical structures are designed to perform their specific function. And sometimes you can predict one from the other, right? So if we know what the form of the skull is, that it's hard and that it encases the brain, and we can kind of infer that one of those functions might be that it's protecting the brain. Without a thorough knowledge of anatomy, the physiologist really can't understand the structure's function. And this is why we're going to generally, the labs are a little bit ahead of lecture, and generally we'll learn about anatomy first, and then we'll talk about physiology. So now that we've kind of discussed what anatomy and physiology are and things, this is kind of, we'll be learning all about anatomy and physiology for the whole class. We're going to start at the bottom. We're going to start at what is a living thing, because humans are living things, right? And we're made of cells and tissues, and we're going to break all of this down. We're going to say, what is a living thing? What characteristics describe living things? And then we're going to talk about the sort of organization of life and the body's levels of organization. So all living things, no matter what they are, if they're humans or dogs or cats, they have a couple of things that are similar. And so all of them exhibit a complex structure and order. And we're going to go over those levels of organization in just a few slides. So we'll learn about that in this class. All of them also have what's called metabolism. Metabolism is the sum total of all of the chemical reactions that are occurring in the body. There are two different types. We have some chemical reactions that take smaller molecules and build them together to form bigger molecules. This is called anabolism. And I kind of think about this, if you maybe have heard about anabolic steroids, and they are illegally used sometimes in order to build muscle. So you can think of anabolic things building things. Small molecules are joined to form larger ones. So they're not good. They shouldn't be taken. They have lots of side effects. But it's just a way to remember. The other thing is the other type of reactions that could occur are that larger molecules are broken down to form smaller ones. And this is called catabolism. And I think about cats and how cats like to break things sometimes, especially kittens, right? They like to tear apart the toilet paper. And so I remember that catabolism is breaking things down. Large molecules broken down into smaller ones. So the third property that's common is that all living things are going to grow and develop. And in order to do this, they need to take in things from the environment, utilize that energy that they get from there to nourish themselves and grow and develop. All things are also responsive to external stimuli. So they have the ability to sense and react to stimuli, and the nervous system is going to be really important for this. And that's going to be like the second half of this course is going to be talking about the nervous system. Next is regulate. So first they're going to sense the stimuli, and right, they might sense a change in the stimuli, like maybe you're cold, right? So you're really cold, but you might want to regulate your body temperature. And so we might want to, if we feel cold, we want to regulate it and become warm again. And so regulation means that a lot of living things have the ability to adjust their internal bodily function to accommodate changes in the environment. And homeostasis is a really big thing that we're going to talk about. Homeostasis is the ability to maintain the body's structure and function, usually in the face of changes in the external or internal environment. So we want everything to kind of stay balanced. So homeostasis is a very important concept, and we'll talk about that at the end of this lecture. And then finally, all organisms are able to reproduce, right? And this is two different types. We can produce new cells for growth, maintenance, and repair. So if you scrape your skin, you're going to grow new skin cells. But also we can reproduce with sex cells or gametes to form a whole new organism. So those are the 6 characteristics that describe living things. So organization, metabolism, growth and development, responsiveness, regulation, and reproduction. So the first one we said was organization. So we're going to kind of stop a little bit and talk about organization and how life is organized from the simplest things to the most complex. And we're going to kind of talk about, as we go through our study of this book, of anatomy and physiology, we're going to start down at the very simple level and then start learning about we'll start learning about chemicals. So chapter 2 are atoms and molecules. So next chapter we're going to start at the chemical level. These are very small little things. After that, chapter 3 will also be about the chemical level. Chapter 4 moves up to the cellular level. This is where our chemicals have combined, and lots of these atoms and molecules together form cells, which are the basic units of life. And chapter 4 is all about cells and how they function. Now, if we take our cells and we have our cells and we join them together, we have tissues, the tissue level. This is going to be chapter 5 is going to be where we start talking about tissues. Similar cells performing common functions. So they're all going to work together to perform a common function. Next, if we have tissues together, usually 2 or more tissue types that work together to form a common function, this is going to be an organ. And so after chapter 5, we're going to be moving on to talking about organs and organ systems. And so an organ is going to be multiple tissue types working together. Then we have multiple organs that work together to perform a common function. And that's the organ system level. So for example, we might have the cardiovascular system where we have the heart and the blood vessels working together, or we have the digestive system where we have the stomach and the intestines and the liver and the pancreas working together. And then finally, we have the organismal level. And this is going to be, a human or a dog or a frog. All of the organ systems work together in order to maintain this organism and let the organism do all the things that it cause the organism to have metabolism, to grow and develop, to be responsive, to regulate its own body system, and to be able to reproduce. So all of the chemicals work together to form cells, the cells work together to form tissues, the tissues work together to form organs, the organs work together to form organ systems, and finally those organ systems work together to create an organism. And so we can see here, we're going to start at the chemical level, and all of these things, and atoms and molecules and macromolecules, are going to be kind of part of the chemical level. They're going to make organelles, which are still smaller than a cell, so technically still part of the chemical level. Organelle is a small little organ inside a cell. Then we move up to the cellular level. So all of these molecules together work together to form cells. Now, bunches of cells together are going to form tissues. Bunches of tissues together form organs, bunches of organs together form organ systems, and then finally all of our organ systems form an organism. So there's also a little introduction worksheet about this that we can look at and talk about. I have it, it's in the extra chapter 1 worksheets. So as we said, we have a lot of organ systems that work together to form the human organism. And so there are 11 organ systems in the human body. And we're going to study them in roughly this order. So in 168, we're going to cover the first 4. So we're going to cover the integumentary system, the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the nervous system. So that's 168. We also, remember, are going to review the chemical structures of the body, and we're going to talk about cells, and we're going to talk about tissues. And the nervous system's pretty big. It's got a lot of important stuff in it. Then 169, we're going to talk about all the rest. So 169, we'll talk about the endocrine system, cardiovascular system, lymphatic, respiratory, urinary, digestive, and male and female reproductive systems. So, but I do want you guys in this class to sort of just understand the general functions of these body systems and understand what the major organs of these body systems are. And that's one of the things that in lab you guys are going to look at APR, and you're going to look at some of which is our Anatomy and Physiology Revealed, the cadaver dissection system, and it's got some pictures of some different organ systems and different organs, and you'll identify which organ systems they belong to. So as we can see, the integumentary system is going to be the first. So this one right here, all of these we're going to learn about in 168 in much greater detail. But basically, the integumentary system covers our skin, it regulates body temperature, it's important for sensation. We have lots of different touch receptors here. And it's made up of the hair, the skin, and our sweat glands. Next we have the skeletal system. And the skeletal system is made up of bones, it's made up of ligaments, which connect the bones together. We have tendons that connect muscles to the bones. It has bone marrow within the bones, and some of the important things that the skeletal system does, it helps us with movement, it helps us with protection, regulating the levels of calcium in the body, as well as the bones actually help make blood cells. The bone marrow is going to help make blood cells. Next we have the muscular system, right? And the main organs in the muscular system are our muscles, right? So we have lots of muscles. They produce the movement in the body, but they also produce heat. They're important for thermoregulation. Our nervous system is going to be our brain, our spinal cord, and our nerves and our ganglia. and this is really important for sensing things. So we're going to sense like all sorts of sensations that are going to be sent up to the brain, and then the brain is going to decide what to do about them. It's the control system of the body. And then it's also going to be responsible for conscious voluntary movement, as well as intelligence, memory, and consciousness. So this is what we're going to be talking about this class. Then in 169, we'll move on to the other organ systems. So the first one is the endocrine system. The endocrine system is going to be made up of lots of glands and some things in the brain too, so pieces of the brain. So the hypothalamus, pineal, and pituitary gland, we'll learn about these in the nervous system also. The thyroid gland, the thymus, adrenal glands, pancreas, kidney, testes. So all of these are going to be important in the endocrine system. The endocrine system is the other important control system of the body. So first we had the nervous system, which is going to control things via nerves. Now we have the endocrine system. All these glands are going to be releasing hormones, and those hormones are going to help, keep our body in homeostasis. The cardiovascular system is made of the heart and the blood vessels, and this is important for transporting blood around the body to distribute hormones, gases, and pick up waste products. And it works in concert with the respiratory system, right? And this respiratory system here is going to be really important for, it's made up of the nose, the trachea, the bronchi, the lungs especially. And this is going to be important for gas exchange, right? So we're going to be taking oxygen from the atmosphere and then bringing it into the blood. And then the cardiovascular system can take that oxygen to the tissues. So these two are very kind of interrelated. Here, this is the lymphatic system. I feel like this is an underrated system. This system is going to be important for helping the cardiovascular system. It's going to pick up some of this extra fluid that would otherwise get lost and left in the tissue, as well as it's important for helping with the immune system. And so this is where a lot of our immune cells are going to be stored, as well as they're going to be maturing in things like the thymus. And our lymph nodes are going to be part of here. And so our immune cells are going to hang out in those lymph nodes, and they're going to help patrol the body and protect us from pathogens and invaders. The final systems we have are the urinary system, or the renal system. And our kidneys here are going to filter the blood, and we're filtering liquid waste out of the blood. And so our kidneys, urinary bladder, and urethra and ureters are important organs. Our digestive system has a lot of different organs. It starts with the mouth and the oral cavity. We've got teeth and salivary glands, go down to the esophagus, our liver, which is an underrated organ also, but it's very important, our stomach, large and small intestines. In the digestive system, we're going to be ingesting food and then breaking it down to absorb all of the nutrients and energy that we can get from that food. We're also going to be, another important function of especially the large intestine is going to be getting rid of our solid waste. Then finally, we have the male and female reproductive systems, and these systems are going to be really important for making those male and female sex cells, or gametes, right? So the egg and the sperm. And so the female reproductive system is also going to provide housing for the developing embryo, right? So that we can have a new organism form, and the mammary glands are important for, nourishing that baby once it's born. So the last portion, I know if you've read the book through, we're skipping some of the anatomical terminology, and we're going to talk about that in lab. And we're moving on to this other physiology concept, and it's called homeostasis. And this is one of the most important concepts that we'll talk about in 168 and 169. We will keep coming back to homeostasis. The basic function of many, many of our body systems is to keep the internal conditions stable. So the definition of homeostasis is the ability of an organism to maintain a consistent internal environment in response to a changing internal or external conditions. And so there are three components to homeostatic systems, and we're going to look at them. And there's a nice worksheet that we'll go over that likens them to a thermostat in the house. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the components of homeostatic systems are going to be the receptor. So, and this is going to be part of the nervous system usually. Sometimes it's part of the endocrine system, and it is going to monitor a variable. It's going to monitor this variable, and if it changes, we call that a stimulus. So the change in this variable is a stimulus. So in this example, it's the change in temperature that's sensed by the skin. So if, say, we're outside and it's a really cold day, our thermoreceptors in our skin are going to say, hey, it's really cold out here. And they're going to send that information along nerves up to the brain, or whatever the control center is. But in this case, it's going to be the brain. And the control center is it's usually either the nervous system or the endocrine system that's going to receive this information from the receptor and interpret it and decide what to do about it. And then it's going to tell an effector what to do. And so the nervous system is faster, right? We have direct nerves, like, think of them as little wires running from your receptors up to your brain and then from your brain to your muscles or your glands. And so the nervous system provides a really quick response, but it usually doesn't last quite as long. Whereas the endocrine response, remember we said endocrine organs release hormones. And so hormones are little chemical messengers that they travel through the blood. So they don't have these direct wires like the nerves are. They just kind of, I guess you can think of it as like wireless almost. They go through the blood. So it takes a little bit longer because it doesn't go directly through the wire. It has to travel through the blood, and it takes a little bit longer, but the response is more sustained. And so they're going to use either nerves or hormones to talk to an effector. An effector is something that's going to cause an effect. It's the structure that brings about the change to alter the stimulus. So let's say in our body temperature example, we talked about the receptor, which is a thermoreceptor. It's a little, nerve in the skin that detects temperature changes. It's going to send its information up a nerve through the nervous system up to the brain. And in the brain, we have an area of the brain called the hypothalamus that's going to be important for regulating body temperature. The hypothalamus is going to say, oh, it's really cold outside, so we should, our body temperature is getting low, we should increase the body temperature. Then it's going to send more nerves down to your effectors. And in this case, maybe the skeletal muscles, and it's going to cause you to shiver, right? And so this is a general sort of homeostatic control mechanism. It's empty. It doesn't give us any exact examples. But in the rest of our book, we'll see these pictures here where we have the stimulus, receptor, control center, and effector. And we'll see these in many different chapters to talk about many of the homeostatic control mechanisms we have. So you do want to make sure that you know how these work together and what the order of this is. So first we have a stimulus, which is that change in a variable, in that regulated variable. The stimulus is going to activate a receptor. So the receptor detects the stimulus. Then the receptor is going to send the information either through nerves or hormones. Sometimes the receptor and the control center are the same thing, so it doesn't really even need to send it anywhere. The control center integrates, it receives the information, integrates it, so makes a decision, decides what to do about it. And then it's going to send information to an effector. And it's usually in the nervous system, it's going to send it via nerves. In the endocrine system, it sends it via hormones. That effector is a structure that's either a muscle or a gland usually that's going to do something. It releases a hormone, or it's going to move a muscle, it's going to constrict something or dilate something. And it's going to bring about a change to that stimulus to restore homeostasis. And as we can see, homeostasis is in the middle, right? That's that set point. It's where we want to be. So there are two different ways that we can regulate homeostasis. They can be regulated by either negative feedback or positive feedback. And we'll talk about negative feedback first. This is the most common mechanism in the body, and it's kind of the most intuitive. And this is the one where we kind of relate it to the thermostat in your house. In this case, our variable fluctuates within a normal range around what we call a set point. And so here's the set point. And so let's say our body temperature, our set point is somewhere around 98.6. But sometimes if it's a little bit cold out or a little bit hot outside and we're running, it'll get a little bit higher. And then once that happens, when we start getting too hot, we're going to start sweating, right? And that sweat, so now maybe we're sweating and it's outside and the wind blows. And if you've ever felt that, oh, you get a little bit cold. Now you're a little bit chilly, right? So it goes down here. And so then, maybe you stand out in the sun you wipe the sweat off, you stand out in the sun for a little while. Oh, it's getting hot again. You start sweating again. And so your body is trying to maintain your temperature around that set point. And so usually if you get hot, your body says, oh, it's too hot, and it tries to cool you down. If you get cold, your body said, oh, too cold, and it tries to warm you up. And so in general, the stimulus is going to be like, oh, it's too hot. When the stimulus is going to be too high, in this case, the temperature is too high, the body's response is to lower the temperature. So the stimulus and the resulting action are in opposite directions. So if you're too hot, the body tries to cool down. If you're too cold, the body tries to heat up. And so in this case, that's going to always bring our body temperature back to that set point. And so in this case, this is the graph that usually results. We have this little, almost like a sine wave here that's going to be revolving around our set point. If you've ever taken your temperature, you know it's not usually always exactly 98.6. It gets a little higher, it gets a little lower, it gets a little higher, and that's why we have this little fluctuating curve. So the opposite, or I guess the counterpart to our negative feedback, is positive feedback. And positive feedback occurs a lot less frequently in the body, but it is really important. And so in positive feedback, the body has got to get something done. This is kind of the way I think about it. There is something that, it's an event that's important that needs to get done. We don't always do it. And once that thing is done, then we go back to homeostasis. And so in this case, we have a stimulus, and our stimulus is going to be going in one direction, and positive feedback is going to continue that. It's going to move that variable in the same direction. It's going to continue to reinforce that variable until some sort of climactic event occurs, and then the body returns back to homeostasis. And now it might be a little bit confusing now, but the really good example that I like to give is the positive feedback mechanism of labor. So let's say a woman is having a baby, and normally the uterus is not contracting, right? The uterus is fairly relaxed, and it's normally pretty calm. But when the woman is ready, the baby's ready to be born, the head is going to be pushing on the cervix. And there are stretch receptors in the cervix that are like, hey, there's stretching happening here. The baby's head is in the cervix. And what happens then is that's going to send information up to the control center, and oxytocin is going to be released. And oxytocin is going to cause the uterus to contract. And that contraction is actually going to cause the baby's head to stimulate the cervix more. And so that's going to cause more oxytocin to be released. And it's going to cause the uterus to contract even more. And that's going to push the baby even more. And it's going to cause the cervix to be stretched even more. And so this is going to keep happening, right? Because we want the baby to be born. We don't want the body to say, oh, I'm going to stop contracting. Because if that happened, then the baby would still be, in the uterus, and the baby wouldn't be expelled into the world. And we don't want that to happen. We need the baby to be born. And so this positive feedback mechanism, we're going to keep that uterus contracting, and then, it's going to be stretching. The cervix is going to be stretching and dilating until, parturition, until birth happens and the baby is expelled. And once that happens, there is no more stretching on the cervix. There's nothing to stretch the cervix anymore. And so there's no more oxytocin that needs to be released. And so we can go back to homeostasis after that climactic event. Other examples are going to be breastfeeding and blood clotting. And so we can see breastfeeding here. We've got the baby suckling at the breast. We have sensory receptors in the skin of the breast that detect the suckling, and that sends an impulse up to the control center, which is the hypothalamus in the brain. The same control center as we had for body temperature. The hypothalamus does a lot. We'll talk about that in the nervous system. It's going to signal the posterior pituitary gland to release that same hormone we talked about, oxytocin. Oxytocin is then, besides uterine contraction, it also causes the release of breast milk. And so the oxytocin then goes to the breast, and it stimulates the breast to eject breast milk. The breast milk is released, and the baby is like, ooh, this is delicious, and continues to suckle, right? And so as the baby continues to suckle, is going to continue to stimulate the breast, which is going to cause more breast milk to be released. And then this is going to kind of keep going until the breast is empty or the infant is full and stops suckling. And then that's going to kind of go back to homeostasis. And then we'll have prolactin, which is another hormone that's going to cause more breast milk to be made, and the baby can eat again later. So homeostatic control systems are really important. We're going to talk about them in lots of different systems. We've already given you a couple of examples here. The control center is generally the nervous system or the endocrine system. So when we talk about them, we'll say, okay, in this case, the control center is the hypothalamus, or in this case, the control center is the pancreas. And we have the three components. And whenever we say these are the three components of the homeostatic control system, but almost always we talk about the stimulus first. So if you remember this guy up here, so we talk about what the stimulus is. So what causes a change in that variable, or what is the change in that variable that's regulated? And then we talk about the receptor, which is the structure that detects the stimulus, then the control center, and then the effector. Normally, most commonly, they're regulated through negative feedback. But we do have positive feedback in some certain situations, which is less common, and usually we'll mention it because it's kind of like, oh, this is, if we don't say what type of feedback it is, it's generally negative feedback. Positive feedback will be like, and this is positive feedback. So, and if these systems fail, then we have what's called a homeostatic imbalance, right? That would mean that our body is not maintaining at its correct set point. We might not be at the right temperature. Our blood might not be at the right pH. Our blood sugar might be too high or too low, and this can cause disease. And so homeostasis is going to be maintaining everything in, the right healthy levels. So, and if we can't maintain homeostasis, that's going to cause damages to different systems, and it can cause disease to result. So in order to kind of monitor our patients, we look at their different bodily functions. We look at their vital signs, right? We look at body temperature, we look at blood glucose, we look at blood pressure, and we want to see if they are maintaining homeostasis correctly, right? We want to see if their body temperature is normal. We want to see if their blood glucose is normal, or if their blood pressure is normal. And in order to do that, we have to establish normal ranges. So a long time ago, they went through and, found a whole bunch of healthy volunteers, and they measured their temperature, their glucose, and their blood pressure, and then they established these ranges. And now we use these ranges as the normal values when we, test the rest of the population. So whenever we do a blood test, or whenever we, take vital signs on someone, we're kind of sampling their all of their values and seeing if they fall within normal ranges, to see if they are maintaining homeostasis appropriately. If the body temperature is too high, we have to be like, well, were they just running around in 100-degree heat, or maybe they have a fever? Maybe they have a fever. There's something wrong there. If blood glucose is too high, we're like, well, maybe either they just ate cake, or, they could have a homeostatic imbalance like diabetes. If their blood pressure is too high, then, maybe they have atherosclerosis, or something that causes high blood pressure. And so, as I said, these normal ranges were determined by kind of sampling random healthy individuals and looking at the confidence intervals. So 95% of normal individuals should normally fall within these normal ranges. But we do have a couple of people that, they might have slightly lower body temperature than normal, or their glucose might be a little bit off. So about 5%, but it's a fairly small percentage. And it should be close to that normal. So we're going to talk a little bit about homeostatic imbalance, right? And this is when the homeostatic mechanisms are going to fail. So normally we want everything to stay at its normal set point, but sometimes this doesn't work properly. So diabetes is a good example of a homeostatic imbalance. So as we said before, blood glucose should range somewhere between 80 and 110 milligrams per deciliter. But in this case, blood glucose, our homeostatic mechanisms for regulating blood glucose are not working right. And so therefore our blood glucose can be really high usually. And so in order to do this, we have to treat the patient by finding a diagnosis. So first we have to figure out what's wrong. What is causing this homeostatic imbalance? Is it type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes? Is it insulin dependent or non-insulin dependent? Why is this happening? Where is the breakdown? And then once they figure out well, is the pancreas not secreting insulin and maybe we need to give them insulin, or are the cells not responding to insulin and we have to make the cells more responsive to insulin? Then we can figure out a couple of different medications and give them medications. But the medications are to try to help restore homeostasis. If the pancreas, which is an endocrine organ, is not creating insulin, and insulin is what helps keep our blood sugar low, we'll talk about this a lot more in 169, then in order to fix this, we can say, well, if the pancreas isn't making insulin, maybe we can give the patient insulin. But obviously, it's going to be a lot harder. You're going to have to give them insulin at specific times a day. So most medications have benefits and side effects. And so, for example, if we give too much insulin accidentally, that can really lower the blood sugar too low, and then that can cause problems too. So in your book, you might have read a little bit about the scientific method in the very beginning of the chapter. And the scientific method is just kind of a scientist's way to observe something, develop a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, and so on. And our clinicians or doctors can use the scientific method. So first, they're going to develop a diagnosis. So we're going to try to figure out what's wrong with the patient. So we're going to examine the patient, observe them, and gather data. Then we're going to come up with a list of, well, these are some things that might be wrong with the patient based on that data. So that's like a hypothetical diagnosis. So we're going to try to rule out these diagnoses and figure out which one of these fits our symptoms. Then we're going to order tests, which is kind of like doing an experiment, right? We're going to test their blood sugar. We're going to, do a urinalysis. We might take x-rays. And then when we get the results of those tests, we're going to see, hey, is our original diagnosis, like that we thought maybe it was diabetes, does it confirm that? Or maybe not. Maybe it doesn't confirm diabetes, so we have to figure out maybe it's a different diagnosis. So we can confirm, modify, or reject our initial diagnosis. And then eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to figure out, like we'll get enough information to figure out what the definitive diagnosis is, and then we can treat the patient. So, and as we do treat the patient, usually we're going to be either telling them to change their lifestyle, or we're going to be, a lot of times we'll prescribe drugs or different medications. And a lot of these drugs or medications are going to affect normal homeostatic control mechanisms. And so and a good example of this is an SSRI, or a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And we'll mention this again in the nervous system. But serotonin is a neurotransmitter that's found in the brain, and patients with depression might have lower levels of serotonin. So because we figure that the problem is we don't have enough serotonin, we want to increase the levels of serotonin or make the serotonin they have more active. And so SSRI drugs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are going to block the reuptake of serotonin into the nerve cells. So normally nerve cells release serotonin and then take it back. And the only time it's active, it's when it's released into the synapse. So if we block them taking it back, that means that serotonin that they release is going to stay and be active more, stay in the synapse and be active for longer. And it prolongs the serotonin's effect. And so we're hoping that it's going to help elevate mood of a patient with depression. But there are some side effects, right? Because serotonin isn't only used in the central nervous system, and it's not just doesn't just have effects on mood. It also has effects on the digestive system, right? So it's also used in the nerve cells of the digestive system, and so because of that, the digestive system might become more excitable due to that SSRI, and it can cause nausea and upset stomach. So a lot of times when we're trying to fix one thing with the medication, we might cause some side effects in another area. All right, so that is going to be it for our first lecture. I know that was probably a little bit overwhelming. It's a lot of information to go over. But there are a selection of worksheets you guys can work on for practice, and there are lots of different assignments that will hopefully help. And I do have some Edpuzzle videos you guys can watch. There's one on homeostasis. That's good. So I will see you for our Chapter 1 lab.